Good morning and welcome to People on Purpose, where we share stories of purpose-driven people doing good in the world. We'll be game changers, agents, entrepreneurs, students, teachers, and the big thinkers to learn about their wow moments and how it got them to where they are today. I am your host, Daniel Shakhani. I'm the co-founder of Salary Finance's Social Entrepreneur, and it is an honor today to welcome onto the show Justine Lutterodt, a dear friend of mine who has very kindly joined us, our guest. She's iconic in her own field. She's a renowned innovator. She has done some amazing work on social and mindful exclusion. And with that in mind, I'd like to welcome you, Justine, to the show.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning to you. And in the run-up to the World Economic Forum, this is part of a series of podcasts we're doing. And of course, coming up to WEF, Justine, there are a lot of big themes at Davos that they're going to be focused on. Everything from Ukraine, shining a light on the importance of global cooperation, which I think is so relevant to the work you've done on the research. And particularly, I think the theme we've picked up on already is why fragmentation is so important to collaborate now in the world we live today. And so the themes we're seeing coming up to January, the World Economic Forum is running from the 15th through to the 21st. We are seeing a number of themes, of course, where there's interconnected crisis around climate, food and energy. There is increasingly challenges around the world when it comes to recession and, of course, the concerns that many companies have at the moment, including gender inequality and the jobs of tomorrow, right the way to our future is digital and many other themes that are relevant to the work you've done, Justine. So, Justine, thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we kick off with this podcast, I just want to share to our listeners a little bit of context around your work. And I think this is such an important place to start. You very kindly shared with me some of the research you've done. And what's fascinating is through the Chartered Governance Institute, the diverse viewpoints that make for a better board. This is a fascinating area. Persuading boards to accept candidates from non-traditional backgrounds, of course, is a struggle. We often hear, Justine, that there are concerns about whether they are board ready or promotion ready and whether they're senior enough. And likewise, we're seeing advertisements that require non-executive director candidates to have been a CEO or a CFO of a large Fortune 100 or FTSE company. The state of the world today and the need to be increasingly more competitive is more and more concerning. It seems like we are developing a world where competition is a big challenge for many people coming through the education system, of course. But I truly believe, Justine, that collaboration is the new competitive advantage. Justine, your work at the Center for Synchronous Leadership, CSL, where you were really working with a number of companies around the world, looking at performance and how it drawn towards the concept of mindful exclusion. The notion of excluding better really struck a chord with me, Justine. We soon realized, however, that mindful exclusion, of course, addressed a wider range of issues relating to good governance beyond boardrooms and workforce diversity. It provided a deeper systemic lens of examining our criteria for decision-making, aligning them with our ultimate objectives. And grounded in insights for social psychology, we know that mindful exclusion was less about understanding the nuances of specific issues and more about understanding ourselves as human beings and the influences that drive us. So I know you embarked on a journey of mindful inclusion. I know you've done a lot of qualitative interviews through the CSL with major leaders around the world. It'd be good to hear a little bit about some of those leaders you've participated in the interviews, but also you talk a lot about some of the work you're doing around Section 172 of the Companies Act and the move towards increasingly looking at how investors are willing to vote against directors responsible for homogenous boards, not least because of what they've seen as a proxy of having an insular culture within the organization. And then you've gone on to really look at strategic succession planning and a range of issues which are facing boards and grappling from climate change, which is a massive issue at the World Economic Forum in January, to pay disparity, from boardrooms and workforce diversity through to the growing use of AI and the increased scrutiny from regulators and wider public meant that boards are facing new levels of pressure as part of their strategy. So, Justine, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to ask you, please share with me a little bit about your journey and how did you get involved in this and why should we care about it today? Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I think hearing the World Economic Forum themes, I'm really pleased with the selection, and it really aligns with our work, and particularly our latest mindful exclusion report that we've just published, because it's really about the bubble and understanding the bubbles that we live in, that we operate in, and understanding them in less judgmental terms, more mindful terms that allow us to face our own quirks and vulnerabilities and potential as human beings, which is necessary if we actually want to drive change. And so I think that my journey around bubbles and power and systemic change, three things that I'm passionate about and form the basis of a lot of our work at CSL, go way back to my roots. So you can hear from my accent that I am American. I grew up in America, but actually it's not as simple as that, because I'm the only American only person born in America in my entire family. And so I grew up very much without a bubble, I would say. I grew up mixed race, so between Black and white. I grew up between immigrant and American, even within my own family, sort of not being quite one or the other. I grew up with parents who had a very strong academic orientation, and often, connecting with worlds where that was less the case and understanding the validity of those worlds as well. So there were just many levels to which I found myself plugged into different bubbles, different ways of thinking, different social norms, but not really fitting into any of them, and understanding both the value and the limitations of those spaces. And I think I also grew up with a very sharp awareness of power. And that was important because I've come to understand both of my parents grew up in families where they didn't have a huge amount of money, but where they did come from a sense of a privilege in their societal context. Whereas I grew up without an awareness of privilege. I mean, we were not a family that had huge amounts of privilege. But because of that sort of awareness, I think that inside our house, it was quite important to my parents that we didn't accept narratives that sort of implied we had less power. We were very aware of the need for money. We were aware of the need for power, particularly because we were often on the margins. And that sort of was quite formative for me in terms of understanding the importance of education and being very aware of your own power, but also how you could use that power to help improve the system around you so that everyone could actually thrive, not just one group versus another. So I think that all of these elements of my childhood were key components for why I felt so passionately about ethics and went on to study that amongst other things in university, ethics and mathematics, and also for why in the business sector, I really appreciated and wanted to understand how business works, but also to understand how to integrate that clarity of the need for performance with a whole set of issues and challenges that occur in the world beyond business that are very relevant for business's ability to function and its legitimacy in the system within which it operates.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing that background. Let me just take you back to the point where you've just graduated. You've realized some of these challenges that you're facing on a personal level, you very kindly shared, but also more broadly in society. What took you from the areas that you were specifically studying to actually creating CSL and the thought leadership work that you've been doing with leaders around the world? Could you take us on that journey, please?
Thank you. So I left university. I initially worked at a law firm, and I was considering a sort of degree in law and pursuing that career. And I did work around environmental, sort of side of things from a business perspective. So I thought that was interesting. That was eye-opening. I went from there to strategy consulting, and I had the privilege of working at a company founded by Michael Porter. So I got access to some of the most innovative strategic thinking and ideals. And I think in that context, I also saw how hard it was for organizations to live up to very well-intentioned ideals, and how as people, because in management consultancy, you have quite a rapid evolution of power, from one year to the other, things are totally changing for you in terms of being a manager. And I saw how people were affected by that and how I was affected by that. And so that made me sort of want to understand more about psychology and how we were impacted by systems of hierarchy and power. And I got the opportunity to engage with leaders at different organizations and also see how they were holding their power and the ripple effects that had on their decision-making, but also on the cultures that they were creating. So I think, and the other thing I did in that environment is I started a women's network. And so I sort of saw myself getting involved with the grassroots movement of change and learning quite a lot in that process. So I went from there to work at a boutique consultancy, and I'd say that was an intermediate because it sort of provided me space to have a little bit more balanced working hours and space to think, but also to be in a position where I could, instead of, creating the PowerPoint deck and handing it over and having some involvement, where I could actually drive strategy and see change firsthand and understand my strategic decision-making ripple effects as a leader better. And then I finally went ahead and made a career pivot to organizational psychology. I did a master's in that at LSE, and then started this organization. And I think it's my childhood ideals around creating a better society that led me to feel that that's what I needed to do, and also not to join another consultancy, because at the time I really felt that engaging with power was necessary to make the sort of change that I wanted. I felt that business leadership is where the power lies. And I also felt that there was a paradox, what seemed to be a paradox, between the financial and organizational performance narrative and what was good for society. And I thought I had some insights to help address that, and that it didn't have to be either or. And actually, both business and society would be better off if you could find the way to sort of reconcile that tension. And so that was very much from the very start what was at the root of what we were trying to create with CSL.
This is fantastic. Justine, we've just come out, obviously, this pandemic, and in many respects, I feel the world is broken. We have so many challenges that we're facing right now. The level of polarization that exists in societies, in communities, is extremely worrying for us. And it also strikes me where there is immense stress and pain, there is opportunity for immense growth. Do you think that now is the time that we can instigate that change that is so needed in society today, more so than ever? And you've seen many business leaders like Mark Benioff of Salesforce and many others, and a good friend of mine, Philip Ullman, is a good example of this, who have dedicated themselves to really trying to fix some of the big challenges that exist out there. Is now the best time to be really doing this, because we are on our knees. We are in a period of time where there is real change that's needed, and systemic change that can be scalable, that can address these big issues. And how do we really think about making that happen? So a couple of questions I'd love to get your perspective on.
In terms of is now is the time, I think that is a really important question, because it's easy to say for various reasons at various points in time that now is not the time. I don't have time. And that instinct comes from us feeling a tremendous amount of pressure, particularly pressure for survival, of the pace of change just being so fast, and there being a lot of overwhelm, and organizations feeling like they're on the back foot, or they could be on the back foot. And that's, as human beings, how we respond to survival pressures. We tend to go reactive. We tend to sort of ignore the thing that seems like a nice to have, and our sense of what is a nice to have and isn't is really just based on what we've experienced personally so far. And so I think it's a very easy cocktail of circumstances that could lead people to think it's not the right time, or I'll get to that. As all of us might know from our New Year's resolutions, I'll get to that. But I think actually right now is a critical moment. And I think it's a critical moment because when it comes to being on the back foot, when you think you don't have time is when you need to act. The more time passes, the less ability you have to make change, the less control you therefore have. And right now, there's a crisis in terms of trust with different stakeholder groups, as some are being quite dramatically affected and others are not. And that inequality now is the moment where some of those differences can be addressed in a harmonious way COVID created a moment where we all felt pain together. And it created a moment that, not to the same extent, but there was a unifying moment. That's the reason why I think there was this sudden awareness of people in different parts of society and different roles, and an appreciation of nurses, an appreciation of people, sort of working in stores. It was this unifying moment. And in that moment, businesses were able to achieve a level of transformation on things that they sort of knew were on their list, but which they put off. And that included digital transformation. And we see that in the first Mindful Exclusion report, huge shift in terms of how digital was being prioritized. And, the things that many organizations didn't think were possible in terms of working from home, flexible working, and whole sectors that said, had said for years, this doesn't work for our sector, suddenly in a short space of time, innovated and were able to figure it out. And certain stakeholders who were longing for that change benefited immediately from that sort of norm being broadened and evolving. So we're at this point in time now where we know what's possible. We also know what it feels like to sense something at the same time and to feel scared together. And we therefore are more connected with a sense of vulnerability than we were before COVID. But we're also at a point of time, and this is what our second Mindful Exclusion report, I can say a little bit more about that report and sort of how the findings are structured. But we're also at a time when we're seeing a retreat back to behaviors, back to things as they were before COVID. So we're seeing that in the circles of power, there's a retreat back to the issues that used to be on the agenda, and issues such as impact on society, even innovation are dropping off. They're dropping off. Those two are actually rolling back to where they were, to a lower state on the agenda than they were before COVID. We're seeing a retreat to lower levels of psychological safety in motion. And we're seeing a sort of default to wanting to sort of play it safe in terms of who you select, even though there have been some strides which are worth noting and calling out in terms of diversity. We're seeing that the value of different lived experiences is rolling back. So we're at a moment where we're on the verge of retreating, possibly to a place that is less healthy than where we were prior to COVID. But we also have this awareness of what's possible and this awareness of other parts of society that we didn't have. And at the same time, there's a shift in terms of what employees and customers and different stakeholders in society want, and in their ability to have power in those relationships. So long way of saying, I think now is a really important time for leaders and for businesses to take action.
It sounds like that, very much so. And we're on a knife edge. We could go either direction. And it is so important that the right stakeholders come together, not just to be a talking shop at some of the gatherings around the world, but actually to just drive that change that is so needed. In the mindful exclusion work, I'd like to make that transition to talk a little bit about that. I think what is fascinating about the work you've done is some of the key points that I took away from the reading that I did prior to this podcast. In the business sector, you shared we have not always wanted to see externalities, or rather the unintended consequences of the decisions that do not affect the immediate bottom line, having traditionally been considered a distraction. And so I think that's fascinating, because I think a lot of senior executives these days don't necessarily understand what's going on in their organizations and trying to address some of those big issues. And therefore, one of the companies we've seen that has really tried to address that is Capita, where they've put next generation members of society actually on the board of their company. The inclination to operate within a bubble is not unique to the business sector. You've talked a lot about that already. And how do we stop these bubbles being created, and how do we focus on the right things at this pivotal moment? And however, this inclination can lead even to the most purposeful of us, to amongst us, to stray. So how do we make sure we don't stray away from the core purpose of what these companies and people in society need to do? But what percentage of students stopped to be helped? I thought that was fascinating. And that they're not in a hurry. There's so many people out there, those students right now, that my sense is they're not sure which direction to go. And that what they're looking for in the companies they end up working for is very different from what it would have been, let's say, even pre the pandemic. And while we use terms like quiet quitting and the mass resignation of so many people, I get the sense that some people are now reevaluating their needs and coming back into the workforce. But let me ask you this. If you look at some of the people out there that are listening to this podcast, across the millions of people that are running businesses or looking to make a change, how do we actually affect that today? What would be your practical advice to not only the senior executives, that's one demographic that we're talking to here, but also the next generation, and particularly the Gen X, and how do you manage their concerns, and how do you get that balance between the two? Because there are diverse opinions and various other priorities each of those groups have, but we both need each other to fundamentally drive that change, Justine.
I love your questions. And actually, we do a lot of work in organizations with sort of the leadership and the grassroots voices. And you are seeing a trend, and we have the data in our latest report to sort of validate this, of more next generation boards, or horizon boards, as they're called sometimes, more reverse mentoring. So there are some positive trends, despite the rollback, that can be quite impactful and can actually help your organization form structural habits that will allow you to plug into different voices and different perspectives, even when humans sort of retreat back to their normal way of doing things. But I think what's really important is to understand what I would call the bubble of power. And in the report, I talk about 3 types of bubbles. I talk about the bubble of familiarity, and all human beings know what they know. But often you don't know what you don't know. And what happens is the more you're powerful, the less you can even see. And the more people around you reinforce that you know everything. So the more likely you are to have a bubble that is thickening unless you're taking active measures against it. And this affects the way that we prioritize. And so I can come back to sort of what we're seeing in terms of prioritization behavior. But there's also the bubble of what's comfortable. And often when you're in a position of power, the norms around you have been created for you. And so, and then certain things, the more powerful you get, the harder it is for some people to reconcile that with admitting mistakes, with asking for help, with learning from others. And so what's comfortable, and particularly for those in positions of power, is another bubble. And the final bubble is the bubble of impressive people, or you might call it the bubble of status, and the sense of who is important, who's not important, who should be listened to, who shouldn't be listened to. And we have these default norms around that, and some of them are not helpful. So, the idea that only those at the top of an organization should have input into decision-making is a classic flaw. So there's, or only those who have been useful in the past should be consulted, again, is a classic flaw. And I think in order to address some of these things, and this also goes to your point of the message for leaders and for those who are up and coming, is you need to understand the bubble of power. And in understanding it, you need to understand the good aspect of it, because what matters, and anyone who's at the top of an organization will know, is if efficiency does matter. You don't have that much time, and you will always feel like you don't have time. And there's a struggle right now in terms of whether board members even have enough time to do their job correctly, or whether they need to actually be thinking about investing more time. So when you don't have much time and there's an agenda and you have to exclude some things from the agenda, what gets excluded? And that's why our report is called Mindful Exclusion, because what we're saying is you need to exclude better. You don't have much time. You need to exclude better, but only prioritizing short-term things that you are experienced with handling is a classic flaw. And if you want to be efficient, not just today, not just to feel efficient, but to actually be efficient, you're going to need to factor in things that you don't understand. And you're going to need to make time for perspectives that you're not sure exactly how they fit in, but you can be strategic about that too. It's not allowing all perspectives to take over the entire agenda. So being strategic about how you use time and what you therefore prioritize is really important. And the classic version of prioritizing what you know is what we're seeing the retreat to. And that's why we're seeing impact on society falling way off the agenda this year. We're seeing even employee-related issues at a time when everyone wants attraction, retention, and few organizations feel they've done it correctly. We're seeing a huge retreat in the prioritization of employee well-being, of talent management, of organizational culture. So this sort of behavior that seems logical because you want to be efficient is actually not logical if you take a step back, but you need to be mindful enough in order to do that. In terms of the bubble of comfort, what people want is they want alignment. They want to actually make decisions. They don't want to be riddled in conflict and sort of, they want harmony. But the desire for harmony often shuts down certain voices or leads you to just sort of skip over people who disagree, or to not share your mistakes and create a psychologically safe environment. And so the desire for alignment is something we need to honor. And again, those who are joining boards, those who want to influence at the top of their organization, need to understand the importance of efficiency. They need to understand the importance of alignment and work out a better way to do it, because the current way actually tends to shut down psychological safety. And similarly, there's a need for good judgment and a need for impact. You're under a lot of pressure. You need to have results. And that's why it's easy to just listen to the voice that sounds like it knows what it's talking about, that sounds confident. There's an overemphasis on gravitas, and you'll see me doing air quotes as I say the word, because we tend to be drawn to people who seem confident, like they've all figured it all out. But having the body signals of looking like you figured it all out, or looking like someone who seems to be in power, is very different from having the knowledge and having the perspective that is missing, that's going to actually enrich your decision-making. And the confusion of those two things often leads to worse decision-making, lower impact, errors in judgment, or things that are missed. And so we need to go further into judgment. We need to go further into impact in order to get performance. And if you understand that, again, you can figure out how to exclude better and bring in more diversity, but diversity that's going to work for you. And final point on this, although I have plenty more to say, is that one of the things that we could actually document this year in the report is something I call compulsive homogeneity. And so we saw that the organizations that had the least amount of digital expertise were the least likely to think they needed to prioritize it. The organizations that had the least amount of marketing expertise, the least amount of diversity and inclusion expertise, HR expertise, were the ones that were the least likely to think that they had a problem that needed to be addressed. And interestingly, the same thing applies when it comes to demographic diversity. The ones that had the least amount of gender diversity were the least likely to be prioritizing it. Least amount of racial diversity, LGBT diversity, disability diversity, those were the least likely to be prioritizing it. So the more you have people who look like each other or have the same experience around the table, the less likely you are to see that you're missing something. And hence the bubble and the need to really understand that bubbles, can have value, but to be evolving your bubble in a way that's mindful.
Fantastic. I think the significance of the research you've done really is looking at this from a different lens. I think very much the power of community is critical to be able to drive that change. And the model that you've talked about here and the insights you're sharing are so valuable, because so many people don't have the time to actually research or understand some of these points. What you're really doing is succinctly putting it to them and allowing them to engage on the right things at the right time. Now, we've talked a little bit about evidence of mindless exclusion. We've talked about the bubble of familiarity and engaging with the unfamiliar. We've now evolved the conversation into the bubble bound versus the mindful movers. And I think what is really now we're getting to the crux of this conversation is we're getting to the stage where I want to ask you the question, how do I know I'm on the right track? So if I'm engaging with this and I realize these issues and I've decided to make a conscious decision to make the change that is so needed, how do I know, A, I'm on the right track? How do I know I'm doing it at the right pace? And how do I make sure that I know what good looks like and there is other people buying into it? Because as much as someone may be really inspired by listening to this podcast, or a CEO of a company or an executive may want to drive that necessary change, ultimately, you've got to get other people on the journey, which is why I think the sense of community is so important within the organization. But how do we know we're also on the right track and we keep on track? That is something I'd really like you to share with our listeners.
I think that one of the things that stands out from the findings and also from what we've seen for many years in our work with organizations is the connectivity with diverse stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And so in this latest report, we divide the mindful movers, the ones who are sort of the most proactive in making sure their bubble is evolving into three. We call out three versions of them. The ones who are horizon scanning, the scanners, the ones who are synergizing and creating psychological safety, and the ones who are stewards, and they don't have an attachment to power. They're just looking for what's the perspective that adds the most value here. And I think what we learn from those and is validated by the data are some habits that will help you. And so my question would be, are you open to seeing you're in a bubble? And are you practicing and working through how you can embody those habits? And those habits being horizon scanning, being willing to look ahead into your future and willing to look beyond, look for your blind spots. And so when we segmented based on organizations that look into their future, there's different ways of doing this. Scenario planning, going through exercises where you imagine, what the future is like. And then also blind spots, listening to different groups, listening to people who are relevant for your organization, but where you've perhaps not been as plugged in or not as plugged in at the top. So reverse mentoring, having next generation boards, having pathways to get onto the board of people who don't all look the same. But organizations that really do those two things, even asking at the end of a meeting, creating time on the agenda for what might we be missing. And that's something that from company secretaries talking to them, that's something that several of them said, they found really helpful as a practical takeaway. But as you begin to embed these things as habits in your organization, you begin to then see the change, because you need to get the change that's right for you. And it's about experimentation and forming habits. In the world we're living in, things are moving too quickly for you to just get it right in the moment and move on. You need to have ongoing habits, and you need to be evolving and tweaking and figuring out what's the version of the habit that works for your organization, for your culture. And so that's an example in terms of the scanners. In terms of the synergizers, what we found is it was the willingness to invest in aligning as a team. And that sounds simple. And almost from my perspective, I was thinking, okay, that aligns with the value of having good away days, that aligns with the value of good induction. But understanding that just onboarding people to normal and running with it is not going to take you to the next level. Actually understanding the value, the distinct value that each person offers, the distinct perspectives that each person offers upfront or on an ongoing basis is what allows you in a moment of crisis to know how to use each other and know how to leverage each other and know where your opinion has less validity than someone else's, or where your challenge, might need to be part of the equation so that you can do good conflict. And you can't build that in the moment. And so again, do you have the habits that create psychological safety? And I think that looking at whether you have it or not is very useful. But for me, even more important is, are you building the habits? Because the habits are going to mean that over time, it gets better. If you have psychological safety and you don't have the habits, which is what we see happening now, then over time, guaranteed that psychological safety is going to go down. And in terms of the third one, attachment to power is what we found to be relevant. And so on a practical level, we segmented and looked at the extent to which there were healthy practices of board refreshment and accountability. And the irony is, at most levels of an organization, you're being assessed, and you're being assessed on a regular basis. And if anything, best practice is to be assessed on a continuous basis, not just once a year. But at the top of organizations, there's often not that level of external assessment happening, or even internal assessment can feel, people don't want to offend their colleagues and they want the cohesion. But at no other level of an organization would that be accepted. And so being really able to role model and embrace an openness to getting it wrong, a detachment from power, so that the whole organization can understand that what really matters is the focus on where you're trying to go. And then there is obviously a duty of care to everyone, including at the top, in terms of the role that you play, the respect for that role. And so I think that one of the takeaways for me, and that each organization will have its own version of it, but is getting the right system of habits in place and having a sense of what good looks like, so that you can be evolving as an organization, as opposed to waiting until you realize you're in a bubble because something goes wrong.
Fantastic. I read in the report that the Financial Times, BBC, CBI, and your work has obviously been published at the World Economic Forum as well. What are the organizations that are really doing this well that you would look up to or would actually highlight that are good examples of companies that are embracing these principles, or not all of them necessarily, but some of them or more of them? Could you share with us your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a sensitive question because some of the clients where I've seen the most amazing growth, I can't actually name. But what I will say is I do notice that some organizations are doing amazing things on the inside. And I think the ones that are able to be courageous right now and courageous in articulating their intention, but also courageous on the inside and actually holding themselves accountable to it, and courageous in owning up to the fact that they aren't there yet, are the ones that stand out to me. And so I think that we can all see certain organizations not just saying we have it right, but saying it's not good enough yet, and here's what we're doing about it. And the ones that take that posture create a conversation, and they create a dialogue with their stakeholders by doing that. And they subject themselves to a little bit of scrutiny and make themselves a little bit vulnerable. But when they do that correctly and they live up to it, those are the ones that I think are going to come out and emerge as the ones leading the charge for everyone else.
And when you look at those companies, be that whatever sector it is or whatever region, do you find organizations that are headquartered in a particular region, US, Asia, Europe, or otherwise, more specifically industries, that are more progressive in making that change? And secondly, when you find those companies that are driving that change, you'd expect it's driven from the top, from the chief executive, from the board. Is that always the case? Or is there examples you can share with our listeners as to how those organizations, although I appreciate and respect you can't mention the names, how those organizations have instigated that work and actually been able to facilitate that change?
So first, in terms of regional differences, on the one hand, I'm hesitant because as much as I might see something really good happening in one region and feel judgmental sometimes of things not happening in another region, if I spend enough time in that region, I begin to appreciate that there's areas where that, there might be advantages. And so I tend to, I don't feel like I have enough understanding to comment without feeling like I might be in my own bubble. What I do know is that the regulatory environment and the conversations that are catching fire in the external environment within which an organization operates help. And so organizations that are in countries or that are in, sectors where there is a live conversation around the idea that you may be missing something, that climate change matters, that, employee voice is important, where those external pressures are around, it, on the one hand, forces organizations to have some awareness of it because it becomes a risk if they don't. But on the other hand, it gives organizations that were already doing this an advantage. Their positioning actually as being more progressive starts to pay off more rapidly in terms of their brand. And what we can see this year, we tracked sort of financial performance as well, and we can see the benefit of these habits impacting financial performance. And so I think that there's an acceleration of the performance feedback loop of doing these things now, and that the environment around you is what can actually make things that are good for the long term better for the short term. So I think the external environment matters. In terms of organizations where change happens and it's happening well, we do see organizations engaging with being plugged into what's happening with their employees. And often there are networks, employee networks, for instance, are one way of doing that because it's the collective blind spot, the systemic blind spot. Whatever group may be facing challenges that others are missing, often what they're facing is something in the culture that's not quite aligned, but they're just suffering much more as a result. So often their suffering represents an opportunity for the whole culture to evolve. And that's why women's networks or parental networks have been talking about flexible working for a long time. Organizations that were listening and beginning to at least experiment or think about it were much better positioned to make that pivot. Similarly with disability networks, in terms of for many people who are disabled, the option of working from home can be game-changing for them. And so you sort of see that also LGBT networks, the sort of being your authentic self is something that has penetrated many organizations on a larger scale, but was initiated by some of the challenges that LGBTQ plus individuals face around coming out and having that psychological safety. So leaders that are plugged in to what people are saying, particularly the stuff that might be challenging, and where you see grassroots initiatives that have a more sophisticated approach, because it's important to be able to articulate what's wrong. It's important to have a voice that can be critical, but it's also important to empathize enough to understand what challenges people are facing at the top. With that information, and understand there are human beings at the top. With that information, you can actually begin to reconcile the tensions, or you can begin to speak to people in their own language so that they know what to do with it. And where those sort of bridges and relationships, and in some cases channels, are created, organizations come out of that much more strongly.
I think there are so many gems of knowledge and insight you've shared here today. I hope that it inspires many of the listeners out there to want to learn more about the work you're doing. I think it's fascinating, as we come in to wrap up today's podcast, that the work is ongoing. You know, this is a moving fiefdom. It's not something that's assessing or addressing these issues at a point in time. So you are continuing this research year on year. It'll be fascinating to see how that evolves, and love to have you back on the show to share some of those outcomes and learnings. But also, we've certainly got to the stage, I feel, in the conversation where so much of what you've shared, people are not necessarily giving the time to think about or act upon, more importantly. And I hope this inspires many people out there to really want to start to facilitate at least those conversations. And if they take away just one or two nuggets from what you've shared today, I think that will be a fantastic outcome from this interaction. And for the listeners, and for many young people, I no doubt, that I meet throughout the world, and I try to share some of the insights of what we've achieved and what we've done, I think it's so important they have the opportunity to listen to this as well, because they can, as much as a board member or CEO, could be the person that drives that change as well, if they decide to partake into those conversations and challenge the leadership and not just accept the status quo. Yes.
I just want to share, also given the amazing work that you do, one statistic, because it was one I wanted to just include in this conversation.
Please.
Is that one of the things we tracked this year was the connection to different stakeholders at the top. And one that I think really is important for your audience to hear is that 64%, so 2/3 of those participating at the executive or board level, felt that their executive or board had little or no understanding of people facing poverty. And I just think, given the sort of cost of living crisis that we're in, I wanted to make sure I included that one as well, because I think it's a pretty striking statistic, and one that has big implications.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so important what you've shared. The challenge of in-work poverty is a lifelong work of mine, which I'm passionate about. I feel that it is a massive issue which doesn't get enough focus. Certainly in the United Kingdom, the Lord Mayor cares passionately about this. We created the Financial Inclusion Alliance, as you know, with a view to focusing on that and shining a light on these issues. But I also think that will only change once companies also realize that statistic and the need to be able to facilitate some of the interventions, frankly, that are required to be able to support those people that need that help most. So I really appreciate you saying that, Justine. Thank you so much, on behalf of myself, the team that puts together the podcast, and all our colleagues, for joining us today. It's been fascinating. It's been insightful. It's been exciting. And you've taken us on a journey that has certainly taught me a lot. And I think just reading the report was one perspective, but speaking to you has provided multiple perspectives. And I hope that we continue to stay closely in touch with you as you're on this journey, because I think what you're doing is so critical for the world as it stands today. And that my purpose of doing this podcast as People on Purpose was to shine a light on people doing great work and elevate them so that other people are aware of that work. So I hope that many people will reach out to you on the back of this. And let me ask you a final question. How can our viewers and listeners actually engage with this going forward? What is the next step if they want to learn more about this?
Well, they can certainly email us at info@synchronousleadership.com. That's synchronous leadership.com. They can also find the report, the Mindful Exclusion Report. If they Google Mindful Exclusion and Chartered Governance Institute, they should find a page. And that is, we can provide you with a link. That is a page where they'll find access to last year's 3 reports on the board agenda, boardroom dynamics, boardroom composition, as well as this year's fresh perspective on that data that goes a bit deeper. And then if they want to engage with us in terms of our Step Ahead community and our community of diverse leaders who are feeding into our own insight process, that's something that we can also talk about.
Thank you, Justine, for sharing that. Have a wonderful day, and appreciate you very much being our guest today. Take care. God bless you.